You'll be fine in the garage for a while. That's what Jessica said to me on Christmas morning. She held out this neatly folded wool blanket, like she thought it was a gift or something. She didn't say Mom. She didn't say I'd be warm. She didn't even look at me. Just fine, like I was an old lamp. Or one of those folding chairs you only pull out when there's no room left. Something useful once, but now just in the way. I remember standing there with a candy cane still in my hand. The tree lights were blinking behind her. Doug was flipping through channels in the other room. And Lena, she was halfway up the stairs, just watching, not saying a word. I'm Maggie Odell, 72, used to teach school. I love long novels and collect old recipe cards. People used to ask me for my coconut cream pie. I raised Jessica on casseroles and curfews, taught her how to drive behind St. Mary's in that empty church lot. I held her hand when she lost the baby. And last fall, I sold my house because she said, "You'll always have a place in our home." Apparently, what she really meant was somewhere near the home. The garage smelled like old paint and gasoline. They'd cleared a little corner for me. There was a cot, one pillow, a thin blanket, and a space heater no bigger than a toaster. My boxes were stacked next to the water heater. And when I walked in, still holding that blanket, a spider ran across the floor. That night, after dinner, I thanked her for the generosity. Lena didn't hug me goodnight. She just slipped away. And after that, I started digging through my purse. I found my old digital recorder, the one I used back when I had to remember which kid was struggling with what. Divorce, dyslexia, bullying. I held it for a long time, my thumb just hovering over the little red circle. Then I clicked it on. December 25th, 2021, 10:22 p.m., Bozeman, Montana. It was 11 degrees outside. "This is day one," I whispered. My breath made a little puff in the cold air. Somewhere in the house, someone laughed. They didn't yell. They didn't push. They just made me smaller, like when water boils down and all that's left is the burnt bottom. I lay down on the cot, pulled the blanket up to my chin, kept my coat zipped. I watched the headlights from outside flicker shadows across the ceiling. My daughter had asked me to move in. She helped me sell my home, told me this would bring us closer, that we'd be a real family again. But my toothbrush was in the garage, my name wasn't on the mailbox, and my dinner plate was always left in the sink. Back in May of 2019, Jessica hugged me on the porch and whispered, "You'll always have a place with us." I guess she just never mentioned it would be on concrete. On New Year's Eve, Lena brought me a cup of cocoa. She didn't say anything, didn't come inside, just set it by the door and left. But I saw her eyes. They looked like mine used to, quiet, careful, polite. That night, I wrote down what I'd eaten. Half a roll, chicken breast, 2 spoonfuls of green beans. I also wrote down what time they locked the door, 8:17 p.m. It's strange what you start noticing when you live in a garage, like how silence feels heavy or how soup tastes different when you're not invited to the table. One night, I asked if I could join them to watch TV. Jessica said they were busy, but I saw Doug on the couch with the remote, Lena scrolling on her phone. I wasn't exactly told to leave, but I wasn't welcome either. So I turned the recorder on again. "This is day 6, I said quietly, and I'm still here." If you've ever smiled through something that hurt just to keep the peace, I want you to know you're not alone. Sometimes silence doesn't mean you've given up. Sometimes it just means you're gathering strength. And if you've ever been made to feel like a guest in your own family, I'd really love to hear how you got through it. If it were you lying under a thin blanket in a cold garage, what would you have done next? Years ago, my mother used to say, "Pay attention to the edges of a person's kindness. That's where the truth hides." I never really understood what she meant back then. But now, sitting on an old throw blanket laid over a cracked yoga mat, I was beginning to see those edges in my daughter. Her voice had gone softer, but it was clipped, And her eyes, they kept looking past me like I was just clutter. January in Bozeman is cruel. It's the kind of cold that sinks into your bones and whispers, "You don't belong here." The garage wasn't insulated, and the single bulb overhead made this faint buzzing sound like a nervous fly. Every morning, I'd see my own breath cloud the air as I stretched out my fingers to write. I had found a half-used notebook and an old pen. On the first page, I wrote in big block letters, "Inventory." It wasn't just for food, though I kept track of that too. 2 stale bagels on Monday, a bruised apple by Thursday. But more than food, I started writing down moments. The way Jessica sighed when she handed me clean towels, how Doug wouldn't meet my eyes, the exact time I heard the door lock each night. Then on Tuesday, I heard the kitchen door creak open. Jessica hadn't noticed it didn't latch all the way. Her voice drifted into the garage, sharper than usual. She said, "I'm not spending another year coddling her." Nobody replied, just the low hum of a commercial playing on TV. That night, I picked up the recorder I'd once bought for a memoir I never wrote. I hadn't touched it in years. I pressed the button, whispered the date, and described the sound of her voice. It was flat, brittle, like dry winter grass. 2 days later, Lena quietly slipped me a cinnamon roll wrapped in a napkin. Inside was a sticky note that read, "Sorry about the blanket. Mom shouldn't have yelled." I sat on the plastic tub I was using as a chair and ate it slowly. It tasted like apology, like someone still saw me. That evening, I found my photo album tossed in the trash bin next to the recycling. I pulled it out gently, brushing aside a used paper towel. Inside were pictures of me and Harold at the lake. Baby Jessica, swaddled in yellow. I lifted it out carefully. Jessica didn't say a thing, just muttered something about not needing clutter. I took it back to the garage and laid the damp pages on the ground. Some of the ink had bled, some pages curled up like dried leaves. I didn't try to fix them. I just laid them there like a little quiet goodbye. Benita's voicemail had been playing in my mind all week. That night, I finally called her back. And when she answered, I didn't even say hello. I just said, "You mentioned legal protections for the elderly?" There was a pause, not hesitation, just a quiet moment. Then her voice came through, low and steady. "You ready, Mags?" I looked around, at my notes, at the recorder, at the photo album slowly drying beside me, and I said, "I think I am." I never thought I'd end up using my teacher instincts for something like this, but keeping records, observing tone, writing precise notes, it all came back to me so fast. I'd spent 25 years in classrooms, grading essays with red pens, logging parent calls, sitting through district audits. Turns out all of that was training for something I never saw coming. Now, my classroom was the corner of a garage, lit by this little clip-on lamp I found in the basement. My desk was still that overturned bin, but I'd added a folding chair I bought at a yard sale for $2. And when I sat there, I felt like I had purpose again, like I was building something, even if no one else could see it. Jessica was gone most afternoons. One time she said, "Fitness is my therapy," while adjusting her Lululemon headband. So while she hit the gym and Doug snored away in his recliner, I borrowed Lena's old-school laptop. The Wi-Fi barely reached the garage, but it was just enough. Benita had sent me a link labeled Elder Financial Abuse Reporting Toolkit. Even reading the title made my stomach twist. But I clicked, and I read every single word. There were definitions, case studies, state-by-state resources. I took notes, cross-referenced examples, highlighted anything that sounded like what had happened to me. Each night, I added new files to a folder I named Garage Record. At first, it wasn't much. Screenshots of text messages, photos of grocery receipts with my name on them, a scanned copy of the wire transfer from the sale of my house. But each piece helped build the case. I'd kept records before, but never like this. This wasn't a grade book or a lesson plan. This was defense. This was proof. Proof that love could be used as leverage. That even a family could turn into its own kind of institution. Quiet, smiling, and cruel. I remembered something Doug had said back in November, after I asked if they could turn the heat up. He muttered to Jessica, thinking I couldn't hear, "No one's gonna believe she's being mistreated. She's just dramatic." I typed that sentence word for word into the Notes app and marked the time. One morning, Lena stood in the doorway a little longer than usual. She didn't say anything, just watched me wiping the smudges off the laptop screen. There was something in her eyes I couldn't quite read. Then she shut the door gently behind her, not like before, when it always slammed. That night, I was scanning the utility bill. My name was still on it. Suddenly, the door flew open. Jessica stood there with her hands on her hips. She said, "What are you doing with Lena's laptop?" I didn't look startled. I didn't look guilty. I just looked right at her and said, "Emailing a friend." She narrowed her eyes, but didn't say anything else. Maybe because she didn't think I had anything worth hiding. That's always been her mistake, believing quiet meant harmless. After she left, I checked my phone. There was a message from Benita glowing on the screen. It said, "I've drafted a cease and desist. All I need is your signature." I leaned back in the folding chair. The lamp buzzed faintly above me. I didn't text back right away. I just stared at the screen, then looked over at the manila envelope I'd prepared that morning. It already had most of the documents inside. My signature felt like a matchstick, small, but capable of setting off something I couldn't take back. I took a slow breath. My mother used to say, "Revenge is just pain with good handwriting." But this wasn't revenge. It was clarity. And it was almost time. If you've ever felt like the people you love most were slowly pushing you out, I want to ask you something. How did you handle it? I'm not just talking into a screen. I'm talking to you. Maybe your daughter stopped calling. Maybe someone made you feel like a burden when all you ever did was give. If any of this sounds familiar, leave me a comment. I'd really like to know I'm not the only one. And if you're wondering what happens next, I'm just getting started. Stick around. There's more. Benita's text stayed on my screen for over an hour before I even moved. It said, "I've drafted a cease and desist. All I need is your signature." I must have read it 20 times. It's strange how something made of tiny glowing letters can feel heavier than a packed suitcase. I'd never filed anything more serious than a substitute slip back when I was teaching. But this wasn't really about paperwork. This was me telling my daughter, without raising my voice, that I exist. That what she was doing wasn't just unkind, it was wrong. That morning, I walked 2 blocks to the notary's office. It was tucked between a closed-down ice cream shop and the public library. A little chime rang when I opened the door, but no one looked up. I waited on a chair that creaked every time I shifted. The receptionist handed me a cheap black pen and asked for my ID without ever making eye contact. When it came time to sign, my hand trembled a little. Not because I was scared, it was memory. I used to sign permission slips, bake sale rosters, field trip forms, birthday cards. But signing this, it felt like stepping across a line I hadn't drawn, but could no longer ignore. I signed anyway. Back in the garage, I texted Benita. I wrote, "It's done." She replied with a little check mark and just said, "Brace yourself. Don't sleep there much longer." At 5:36 that evening, Jessica opened her email. I heard her voice from the kitchen, tight, clipped. She said, "What the hell is this?" Dinner that night was leftover pizza from 2 days ago. Doug warmed his up on a paper towel. Jessica didn't touch hers. Lena grabbed a slice and went straight to her room. No one looked at me. The silence just sat there on the table, thick and heavy like cold gravy. Doug tried to break it. He coughed and said, "So, everyone have a good day?" Jessica shot him a look. He went quiet. After dinner, she found me in the hallway. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to sting. She asked, "You seriously want to go to war over this?" I looked at her. I wasn't angry, just tired, and I said, "No, I just want a door that locks and a thermostat." She didn't say anything, just turned and walked off, like she had somewhere more important to be. Maybe she did. That night, I slept in a hoodie and 2 pairs of socks. I opened the voice memo app on my phone, pressed record, and quietly described the silence. I didn't say anything else. By morning, I could feel something had changed, even before I stepped outside. The air felt different. Still, in that way a room feels right after someone walks out. I reached for the garage door, but it wouldn't move. At first, I thought maybe something was stuck. Then I saw it, a silver padlock on the outside handle. I stood there for a moment, fingers numb against the cold metal. Doug's truck was gone. Jessica's SUV was still in the driveway. Inside, the garage smelled like rubber and something else I couldn't quite name. Maybe shame. I sat back down on my folding chair, wrapped the blanket tighter around my shoulders, and whispered to nobody in particular. So this is what retaliation looks like. Still, I didn't cry. I wrote down the time, I made a note about the lock, then I pressed record. Some people think silence wins the argument, but I'd finally learned something. Silence can be evidence too. There's something deeply humiliating about having to knock on your own garage door just to be let out. It makes you feel like less than a guest, like you're not even a person anymore, just some forgotten piece of furniture. That morning, I knocked 3 times. Nothing. I knocked again, louder. Eventually, Doug opened the padlock. He didn't look at me. He said, Jessica was shocked, like that explained anything. Not sorry, not confused, just shocked. And that told me everything I needed to know about where I stood. Still, I didn't cry. I used to believe time would fix things, that Jessica just needed space. Maybe it was the stress of Lena's college applications, or Doug's work, or the pandemic hardening her in ways she didn't mean. But no, time hadn't softened her. It had only made her better at keeping me out. I called Benita and documented the lock, took photos from every angle, marked the time, even filmed a short video. I whispered into the mic, "Day 1, locked in." Outside, the snow had started freezing into thick ridges of ice across the driveway. I watched Doug back out in his truck, the windshield only halfway cleared. Inside, the power flickered again. The little heater let out this soft mechanical sigh, then shut off completely. I pulled my coat closer and put on the old knit hat I used to wear when I did yard duty at Roosevelt Elementary. That hat had been through 20 winters. It would make it through this one too. Later that day, Jessica came into the garage without knocking. She said, "You're poisoning Lena against me," her voice sharp, phone in hand like it might bite. I said, "I haven't said anything to Lena." "She brought you a cinnamon roll, then she gave you that laptop, and now I find this," she said, waving a pink sticky note in my face, saying she wants to help? Are you kidding me? I told her I didn't ask for any of it. She didn't respond, just turned and slammed the door behind her. Doug peeked in about an hour later. He mumbled something about cooling off periods and family tension. I didn't even lift my head from my notes. He didn't stay. That night, I found another sticky note. This one was taped behind the light switch. It said, "Can I help? I'm sorry." I didn't cry. I just stared at it for a long time. Lena's handwriting still looked the same as when she was 10. Round letters, always slanting just a little upward. A day later, she slipped me a small metal key. She whispered, "It's for the front door. You shouldn't have to ask to leave." I held that key like it might break. The next morning, a sheriff's deputy showed up. He was calm, professional, quiet. He asked me 3 questions through the open garage door. Was I safe? Was I being coerced? Did I have somewhere to go? I answered all 3, just like Benita had coached me. He didn't make a scene, just nodded and left. But Jessica's face, her face turned a color I hadn't seen since she was a teenager. Pale, tense, brittle with fury. That night, I lay on the cot, wrapped in every piece of clothing I owned. The key rested in my palm, cool against my skin. I stared up at the garage ceiling and finally let myself say something I hadn't dared to admit out loud until that moment. I didn't raise her to be this way, but I raised myself to survive it. The sheriff's visit wasn't the end. It was just the beginning, like the front gate finally opening. On January 28, 2022, I walked into the Gallatin County Courthouse not as a mother, but as an accuser. That word felt dry and bitter in my mouth. I had spent years teaching children how to use their words, how to lead with kindness. But sometimes, when all your kindness has been used up and wrung out, you have to reach for something firmer, something that leaves a mark, a line in ink. Benita met me at the front door. She looked sharp in a navy coat and the scarf I'd crocheted for her during chemo. She held the manila envelope like a shield. Inside were all the pieces I'd collected: time-stamped photos of the padlock, voice memos, Lena's sticky notes, grocery receipts with my name on them, pages from the little notebook I kept in the garage labeled inventory. We sat under these old, flickering fluorescent lights. A man 2 rows ahead whispered something about a parking ticket. Another one kept bouncing his knee and scrolling through his phone. The room smelled like old coffee and quiet nerves. My coat was clean, my shoes were polished, but my heart, it was pounding loud. When they called our case number, I stood up taller than I thought I could. The courtroom had low ceilings, scuffed linoleum floors, and a judge named Harrison who looked to be in his mid-60s. He had glasses low on his nose, but his eyes were sharp. He reminded me of one of those tired librarians who still cared deeply about every single word in the book. Benita did most of the talking. Her voice stayed steady, measured. She called it elder mistreatment through coercive dependence. She even quoted the legal code. I watched her go through the evidence the way a good teacher walks through a carefully planned lesson. For once, I wasn't the one taking notes. At one point, Judge Harrison looked straight at me and asked, "Do you feel safe in your current living arrangement?" I answered honestly, "Not physically unsafe, Your Honor, but not free and not whole." He paused for a moment, then asked, "And what would you like to see happen?" I told him, "I'd like the right to choose where I live, without guilt, without conditions." He nodded. There wasn't any drama, no gavel slamming, just the soft sound of his pen moving across the paper. Then he said, "Temporary protective order granted. You have full right to seek independent residence effective immediately." It was just one sheet of paper, but when he handed it back to me, it felt heavier than any textbook I ever carried through the halls of a school. Outside the courtroom, Benita finally let out a breath. She said, "Now we can start getting you out of there, for good." I didn't cry, not then. I just folded the paper neatly, tucked it into my coat, and walked into the cold morning air like someone who'd earned every breath. At the bus stop, I reached into the inside pocket of my coat and pulled out another piece of paper. I'd written down a number on it weeks ago after seeing a flyer at the library. Clearwater Oaks Senior Living. The flyer had said, "1 spot left if you act fast." I dialed the number. The phone rang once, then twice. And I said, "Hi, my name's Maggie Halpern. I think you might have a room for me." I know some of you have had to stand up for yourselves in quiet rooms too. Rooms where nobody clapped, but your heart knew exactly what it cost. If you've ever had to choose dignity over comfort or speak up when your voice was shaking, I'd love to know what gave you the strength. I'll read every word. And if it had been you, standing there with that court order in hand, would you have made the call? Or waited one more day? The court gave me space. Now I needed a plan. I wanted to leave quietly, cleanly, but not invisibly. I wasn't going to slip out like a whisper. I needed to leave footprints, even if only for myself. Jessica sent a message through Doug. She said, "Don't make a scene when you go." I almost laughed. Scenes were what they created. Silence had always been my way. At the public library, I spread out everything in front of me. Brochures, apartment listings, a housing guide from Benita, and a yellow legal pad. The pen in my hand scratched the paper with more purpose than I'd felt in months. At the top, I wrote 3 columns: take, leave, never forget. Under take, I started with the obvious: my clothes, medications, the notebook, the documents. Then came the sentimental things: a chipped mug from my retirement party, the scarf Lena knitted when she was 11, a framed photo of me and my husband standing in front of Niagara Falls. The leave list was easier than I expected. It felt like relief. Jessica's birthday platters, the heavy blue vase Doug never let me move, that faux leather ottoman that always squeaked when someone sat down. Under never forget, I wrote just one thing: how it felt to knock on a door I once owned. Benita met me an hour later. She brought a folder and a sandwich I hadn't asked for. That was just her way. She walked me through some modest options: places with ground floor access, a quiet courtyard, maybe even a little community garden. One had 2 windows that faced east, a laundry room, and a tiny kitchenette with real tile. Doug came by that evening while Jessica was out. He didn't say much, just handed me a cooler from the garage, still clean from the last camping trip. He mumbled, "Thought you might need this." I thanked him. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't cruelty either. Later, Lena came by with a small brown bag. Inside were my favorite cinnamon teas and a folded index card. In her handwriting, it said, "Grandma's peach crisp, the way you actually made it, not the cookbook version." I smiled before I could stop myself. She looked a little nervous, then asked, "Can I come visit your new place when you're settled?" I nodded and told her, "Of course, sweetheart. The kettle's always on." Jessica never spoke to me again. She stayed in her room, kept the doors closed, and moved quickly through the house. That was fine. There wasn't anything left to say. 2 nights before I left, I sat at the folding table in the garage and wrote one last note. It wasn't to her, not even to Lena. I simply wrote, "To whatever remains." In the note, I wrote about the lilacs that used to bloom by the kitchen window, the sound of laughter during Sunday dinners, the ghost of comfort still clinging to the wallpaper. I sealed it in an envelope and tucked it into the attic crawl space, behind one of the beams, a place only time would find. The morning mail brought an envelope from the county courthouse. Inside was the final order, signed by Judge Harrison. Protection confirmed, housing support granted. I held it with both hands and let the weight of it settle in. It wasn't just paper. It was proof. It was the opposite of being erased. And it was a beginning I got to write. The apartment was technically smaller than the garage, but it had heat, it had light, and no one cried when I walked into a room. The first thing I unpacked wasn't a blanket or a pan. It was the photo of me and Lena at the zoo. She had blue cotton candy stuck to her chin, and I was laughing, really laughing. That was before I became a burden, before I started counting the minutes someone let me inside their home. The kitchen smelled like fresh paint and cheap disinfectant. The fridge hummed louder than I expected. Benita stood behind me, tossing apples and a carton of eggs onto the counter like she already belonged there. She said, "It's a start." I nodded. I wasn't ready to call it home, but it didn't feel like exile either. That first afternoon, I hung up old postcards from trips I could barely afford. I alphabetized my paperbacks, just like I used to do in my classroom library. I found my grandmother's lace runner, folded at the bottom of a box like a piece of memory, and laid it gently on the windowsill. For the first time in a long while, I arranged something just for me. No one else would use it, and that felt important. That night, I made soup from scratch. Not for guests, not for grandkids, just for myself. I sliced carrots, added thyme, and stirred until the broth warmed more than just my stomach. I ate slowly, watching the sky darken behind the bus stop. No one barged in. No one told me I used too much salt. The knock came just after 7. When I opened the door, Lena was standing there with 2 mugs of cocoa and a nervous smile. She asked, "Can I come in?" I stepped aside without saying anything, but inside, my heart had already said yes. We sat on the floor. She handed me a folder from school. Inside was a writing assignment titled "Someone I Admire." I braced myself for a name like Ben Franklin or Malala, but she said, "I picked you." I blinked and read her words. She never raised her voice, but she never stopped being brave. She taught me how to look people in the eye even when they don't see you. Lena looked up and said softly, "It's not finished. I wanted you to help me." So we did. We added a line about the peach crisp we used to bake, and another one about how sometimes bravery looks like a court form and a borrowed suitcase. After she left, I folded the essay and tucked it behind the photo from the zoo. The next morning, I opened the mailbox and found a letter from the community center. They'd heard about my story. Apparently, Benita had been talking. They invited me to speak at the next Elder Voices event. I laughed out loud, not bitter, not sad, just surprised. Someone thought my voice was worth hearing. That night, my phone buzzed. It was Jessica. Her message was short. "Lena's been distant. Are you filling her head with things?" I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I set the phone down. I didn't write back. I turned off the light, pulled my new blanket around me, and whispered into the quiet, "I'm just telling the truth." I wasn't planning to write her, but sometimes healing needs punctuation, and silence doesn't always bring closure. It was a gray Sunday morning in early March, the kind where the rain taps softly, like it hasn't made up its mind whether to stay. I wrapped myself in the robe Benita gave me for Christmas and sat at the little table near the window. The steam from my tea rose like smoke from a candle that's just been blown out. I pulled out a note card, the kind with pressed violets along the edges, and I began. I didn't expect Jessica to change. That was never the point. I just needed her to know that I had. At first, the words came out in fragments, bits of memory, the outline of old arguments, but I made myself stay in the present. I wrote slowly, on purpose, like each sentence was a thread pulling me away from the woman who used to stand quietly in that garage, waiting for permission to matter. I didn't accuse her. I didn't list everything that hurt. I just wrote what was true for me. I said, "You asked for space. I made a life from it." And I meant that. That space used to feel like a sentence. Now it feels like a choice. I thanked her, not for the past, but for Lena. I wrote, "She reminds me of who I was before I got quiet. She's loud in the right ways. She's curious. She's kind when she thinks no one's watching." I told her I hoped she'd find peace, not the kind that comes from being right, the kind that shows up when you no longer need to be. And I ended the letter with a line that took me weeks to find. I wrote, "I release you from my silence, but not from my love." I read it once, then again, and I didn't change a single word. That afternoon, Lena stopped by with a fresh envelope and a sheet of stamps. She didn't ask what the letter said. She just watched as I sealed it and handed it to her. Then she asked, "Can I mail it?" I nodded. But later, after she left, I walked to the corner mailbox myself. The envelope was still in my hand. My coat flapped open in the wind like a question I already knew the answer to. The rain had softened into mist. It was gentle, steady. I dropped the letter in without ceremony. It didn't feel like surrender. It felt like sovereignty. That night, I slept straight through. No dreams, no wondering, just the quiet knowing that I had said what needed to be said. The next morning, I was rinsing my teacup when I heard a knock at the door. I figured it was Lena again, or maybe a neighbor asking for help with the new laundry machine. But it was Doug. He stood there holding a potted peace lily, the kind that looks like it's already said it's sorry. His coat was damp, his eyes kept shifting, unsure. He said, I didn't know where else to go. I stepped back just enough for the door to stay open, not wide, just enough. If you've ever written a letter you didn't think you'd send, or said goodbye only to find yourself standing in front of a different kind of beginning, I'd love to hear about it. How do you find your voice again after someone made you feel small? If any of this feels familiar, tell me in the comments. And if it were you, standing in my shoes, what would you do when an old face shows up with a peace lily and no apology? I hadn't seen Doug in weeks. The knock was soft, almost like he wasn't sure he meant it. When I opened the door, there he was, damp from the rain, holding a potted sage plant inside a plastic grocery bag. He stared down at the welcome mat like it might open up and swallow him. He said, "Jessica doesn't know I'm here. I just needed to talk to someone who'd listen." The apartment smelled like oatmeal and cinnamon. I had just folded a blanket over the recliner, and the kettle had clicked off a few minutes earlier. I didn't say anything. I just stepped aside and let him in. Some moments don't need permission. They just need space. He held out the plant a little awkwardly. He said, "It was your favorite in the backyard, right? You used to cut little leaves for tea." I nodded and took it from him gently. I placed it near the window where the morning light usually settled. I said, "It still is. Thank you." He sat down on the edge of the couch, hands clasped together like he was waiting for a verdict. He said, "Things are tense. Lena won't talk to Jess. I think she misses you." Then he paused, looked around, and added, "This place, it's small, but nice, peaceful." I poured him a cup of tea and added honey, just the way he used to like it. I handed it to him without asking. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't distance either. It was two people who'd shared too many Thanksgivings to pretend they didn't know each other. We didn't talk about the letter, or the court, or the padlock. He asked me how I liked the bus route. I told him the driver's name is Claudia, and she drives like she's racing to put out a fire. We spoke like old coworkers, courteous, careful, but somewhere between sips, something cracked. He said, "I think Jessica was scared of becoming you." I didn't flinch. I said, "And I think I was scared of seeing myself in her." Then I added, "We were both staring into a mirror, hoping it would blink first." He looked down at his tea, then out the window. Rain speckled the glass. He said, "You know, when Lena was little, she used to draw stick figures of the three of us. You were always the tallest. Jess was always frowning." I smiled, just a little. I said, "She was a serious child, always organizing things, even her toys." He nodded. "She still is, only now it's people, emotions." We sat there in the quiet, not grieving what was gone, just noticing how much had been misplaced long before the garage ever entered the story. Then he cleared his throat. "If she wanted to talk, would you?" I looked out the window and saw a neighbor walking past with a tiny dog in a red sweater. Behind me, the sage plant gave off a soft, earthy scent. I said, "If she showed up as a daughter, not a defendant, yes." Doug nodded slowly. "I'll tell her." I shook my head. "Don't tell her," I said. "Invite her. That's different." He stood up, hesitated, like there was something else he wanted to say, but the words hadn't formed yet. I walked him to the door. He left without a hug, without a promise. Just a man stepping into the rain, carrying uncertainty like an umbrella. But he came, and that meant something. Weeks passed, the kind that melt away slowly, one quiet day at a time, until you suddenly realize your coat's been hanging by the door for days and you haven't needed it. Spring was starting to hint at itself. Crocuses were pushing up through soft ground. Kids were walking home without hats. The snow had thinned, but the silence hadn't. Then came the email. Lena's teacher kept it short. She wrote, "Lena asked if you could be the one to read this out loud at our class reading night. She said it's about you." I read that line more times than I want to admit. I printed it out and pinned it to the fridge with the hummingbird magnet. The night of the event, the middle school auditorium smelled like Elmer's glue and nervous sweat. Parents sat in folding chairs, whispering little pep talks to their kids. Paper butterflies hung from fishing line, spinning slowly under the warm lights overhead. I wore a blouse I hadn't touched in years, the one with the tiny pearl buttons I used to wear for parent-teacher nights. Benita offered to drive me, but I said no. I needed to walk. I needed to feel the ground again, really feel it under my feet. When they called Lena's name, I stood up instead. A few murmurs passed through the room, then everything went quiet. The teacher smiled and handed me the microphone. Lena's essay was printed in 12-point Times New Roman, double-spaced. She'd added little stars in the margins, just like she used to when she was learning how to edit. I took a breath and began. My grandma lives in a small apartment now, but I think she's the biggest person I know. There was a pause, a rustle, someone coughed in the back row, but I kept reading. Some people shout when they want to be heard. My grandma doesn't. She just writes things down. She remembers everything, not to hold a grudge, but to tell the truth. I could feel my voice getting tighter, but I didn't stop. I used to think brave meant loud, but now I think it means staying soft, even when no one listens. When I finished, the room stayed still for a moment. Then came the applause. It wasn't loud, it wasn't overwhelming, just enough. I looked up and saw her, Jessica. She was sitting in the back row, arms crossed, face unreadable. Her eyes didn't meet mine, but I still felt them, the weight of them. Later, Lena found me by the refreshment table. Her cheeks were pink, her eyes were lit up. She said, "You didn't cry too much." I smiled, only on the inside. She hugged me tight. "I hope I'm like you when I'm older." I pulled back just enough to see her face. I told her, "Then I've done something right." We stayed a little longer, talked to other families, listened to poems about dogs and best friends and summer. The butterflies above us kept turning slowly, without hurry. When we finally made our way to the doors, I noticed Jessica standing near the exit. She wasn't walking toward us. She wasn't waving. She was just standing there. I met her eyes for a moment. That was it. Then she turned and walked away. I didn't follow. Some silences, I've learned, are just pauses waiting for breath. Others are periods. That night, I let the punctuation land where it may. Spring came in quietly, like someone slipping into a room they weren't sure they belonged in, but it stayed. The mornings started warming up just enough to open the windows, the kind of mornings where the air carries hints of soil and something sweet, maybe lilacs, blooming somewhere down the block. A robin kept landing on my windowsill, pecking at the glass like he had something to say. I started planting herbs in old plastic tubs I'd scrubbed out behind the building. Basil, mint, a little thyme. Nothing fancy, just things that reminded me I still had hands that could coax life from dirt. No one asked what I was doing. No one needed to give me permission. For once, the space I took up didn't have to be explained. The quilt I sat on while tending the plants was one I'd stitched together myself. Bits of an old flannel nightgown, a strip from Lena's kindergarten apron, even a piece of a t-shirt I used to wear when Jessica was small enough to curl up in my lap. I ran my fingers across the seams like they were braille. There was history stitched into every inch of it. Benita stopped by one afternoon with a loaf of bread, still warm in the paper bag. We sat outside on 2 cheap plastic chairs, talking about everything except the past. Her laugh has this way of shaking the air loose.
Even the stiffest parts of me softened. Lena spent a weekend once, just her, a duffel bag, and a box of puzzles we never quite finished. We made pancakes, we watered the herbs, we stayed up late reading the same book, passing it back and forth, trading paragraphs like old friends. She didn't mention Jessica. I didn't ask. That Sunday night, I started a new journal. Not for keeping records, not for documenting neglect. This one was clean. Blank pages with no plan, just space for whatever needed to grow. I titled the first entry, "Today, Nothing Hurt." Later that week, a letter came in the mail, handwritten, from Jessica. It wasn't long, just 2 sentences. "I'm not ready yet, but I hear you." I read it twice, then I tucked it between the pages of my journal, right after the entry marked Garage, Day 1, just before Apartment, Day 1. It didn't feel like closure, but it felt honest.
That afternoon, the breeze picked up. The basil leaves fluttered like little flags, and I sat outside with a cup of tea, watching the sky shift between soft blue and the hint of rain. I closed the journal but kept it in my lap. The sun hit the porch just right, warming the backs of my hands. I looked around, at the herbs, the empty chair next to me, the welcome mat Lena helped me pick out last month. It says, "You belong here." And some days, I almost believe it without hesitation. The wind stirred again, lifting the top page of the journal just a little. I smiled. Not to anyone, just to the moment, and I said, "Let it grow." And this time, I meant it. Some mornings now, I sit by the window with my tea. I listen to the basil leaves move in the breeze, and I think, this peace I have, it wasn't handed to me. I grew it, not from anger, not even from justice, but from something more stubborn, the quiet belief that I still mattered. Families don't always break loudly. Sometimes they fray, in silence, in assumptions, in being overlooked. But healing doesn't always mean going back. Sometimes it means planting new roots. So if you've ever felt small in a place that once felt safe, I hope you remember this. Your dignity is not up for negotiation. And real love, the kind that stays, doesn't need permission to exist. If any part of my journey reminded you of your own, I'd be honored to hear it. Leave a comment or just carry this story with you, quietly, in your pocket, the way we carry the things that change us. And when you're ready, stay with me for the next chapter. My son left me at a deserted train station, then said, if she still has her mind, she'll find us. It begins with a bench, a suitcase, and the silence that says everything.